No map warns you about it. No sign marks its edge. And yet, everyone knows exactly where it begins. There is a place in the South where conversations change tone the moment its name comes up, where people look away, where laughter fades just a second too fast, where someone will say, "That was a long time ago," even though no one asked when. You don't find this place by accident. You find it because someone hesitates before giving directions, because a road curves when it shouldn't, because the land itself seems tired of carrying what happened here. The houses nearby are ordinary. The trees are old but not remarkable. Birds still sing. Wind still moves through the grass. And yet, something is wrong. People grew up here and left without ever explaining why. Children were warned not to wander, not with anger, but with fear. And the adults, they learned early that silence was safer than truth. This is not a ghost story. There are no monsters hiding in the dark. What happened here was done by people, and that is what makes it harder to face. Before we go any deeper, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and is there a place near you that people refuse to talk about? Subscribe if you believe forgotten stories deserve to be heard. Because every town has one. A road you don't drive at night. A house no one buys, even when it's cheap. A field that was never built on. And when you ask why, you get the same answers. Nothing. It's just old stories. You wouldn't understand. But silence doesn't mean nothing happened. It usually means too much did. The first written mention of this place is easy to miss. It appears not as a headline, but as a footnote, a line tucked between property transfers and crop reports. No details, no explanation, just a name and a date. What's missing is more important than what's written. No mention of who lived there, no record of what became of them, no reason why the land changed hands so suddenly. In the South, land is memory. It tells stories even when people won't. And this land remembers something people tried very hard to forget. Locals learned early which questions not to ask. They learned that curiosity came with consequences, that certain subjects closed doors, that digging into the past could make you unwelcome in the present. Some families passed warnings down like heirlooms. Others buried the past so deeply they convinced themselves it never existed. But there were always signs. A foundation stone no one explained, graves without names, census records that didn't add up, and sometimes someone would say too much. There was an old man who used to sit outside the general store in the evenings. He never talked about the place until one night after too much silence and too many years. He said, "It wasn't supposed to go like that." That was all. The next morning, he acted as if the conversation never happened. When pressed, he laughed and said people imagine things, but fear doesn't imagine itself into existence. The South has a way of smoothing its history, turning brutality into tradition, turning suffering into background noise. What doesn't fit the story gets erased. What can't be erased gets whispered. This place, whatever its name was then, didn't fit. Because what happened here wasn't heroic, it wasn't noble, and it wasn't accidental. At first, the avoidance was subtle. Neighbors crossed the road instead of passing through. Church routes changed. Children were redirected without explanation. Later, the avoidance became deliberate. Property lines were redrawn. Records disappeared. Photographs were removed from albums. And slowly, the place became something else. A gap, a blank space in memory. If you stood there today, you might not feel fear right away. That's the trick. The ground doesn't scream. The buildings don't collapse. Nothing dramatic happens at all. Instead, there's a pressure, a heaviness, the sense that you are standing somewhere that witnessed something it was never meant to survive. And the longer you stay, the clearer it becomes. This was not a single moment. It was a process. Pause. Every story like this begins the same way, with a place no one wants to explain, with people who claim not to remember, with records that stop just before the truth becomes uncomfortable. And that is where we begin, not with what happened, but with why everyone agreed not to say it out loud. Because before there were victims, before there were consequences, before there was silence, there was an official story. And that story was carefully chosen. Every place like this eventually gets an explanation. Not the truth, but a version that's acceptable. Something neat, something complete, something that allows everyone to move on. For this place, the official story appeared years after the events themselves. Not shouted, not announced, just settled into the record as if it had always been there. According to county documents, nothing unusual happened. No crime, no wrongdoing, no reason to ask questions. The land changed hands because of financial hardship. People left because of economic pressure. Deaths, if they were mentioned at all, were labeled natural or unfortunate. That was it. No investigations, no hearings, no follow-up. History, on paper, closed the case before anyone realized a case existed. Newspapers from the period are careful. They use words like incident, dispute, misunderstanding. They avoid names, they avoid numbers. When something is mentioned, it's buried between crop prices and church socials, written as though it deserves no more attention than a broken fence or a sick mule. One article refers to temporary unrest. Another mentions community tensions that were resolved. Resolved how is never explained. The authorities were satisfied, that much is clear. There are signatures where signatures should be, stamps where stamps belong, dates that line up just enough to appear legitimate. The sheriff's report is brief, almost dismissive. No suspects, no charges, no reason to pursue further inquiry. The judge closed the matter without comment. The church preached forgiveness without naming sin. And the town learned how to repeat the story without ever saying it out loud. Official stories are designed to do one thing well. They make discomfort disappear. They give people permission to stop thinking, to stop asking, to stop remembering. And this one worked. For years, decades even, anyone who asked was pointed to the same explanation, same dates, same phrases, same tired reassurances. It was handled. It wasn't what people claim. That's been exaggerated. And eventually, people stopped asking. But the official story has a weakness. It depends on consistency. And this one doesn't hold up as well as it should. The first problem is the timeline. According to records, the land was vacated quickly, but peacefully. Families left within weeks, sometimes days, without legal disputes or sales disputes.
That alone is unusual. People don't abandon homes, crops, and livelihoods without reason, especially not at once, especially not in a region where land meant survival. Yet here, dozens of names simply vanish from the rolls. Not moved, not deceased, just gone. The second problem is silence. If nothing happened, there would be nothing to hide, no need to avoid the topic, no reason for fear to linger. And yet, long after the resolution, people still lowered their voices when the place was mentioned, still warned their children, still refused to pass through. Official stories fade when they're true. This one never did. There is a phrase that appears again and again in the documents. No further action required. It's written with confidence, finality, authority. But it appears too early, before witnesses were interviewed, before neighbors were questioned, before anyone outside a small circle had time to speak, as if the conclusion was decided before the facts were collected. One clerk years later would quietly admit something strange. He said the paperwork arrived already completed, forms filled out in the same handwriting, dates corrected, then corrected again. He was told not to worry about it, that it came from above. Above where, he never knew, and he never asked. This is how official stories are built, not with lies, but with omissions, not with inventions, but with careful exclusions. What you leave out matters more than what you include. And here, what's missing is impossible to ignore. No mention of witnesses who later claimed otherwise, no reference to injuries described in private letters, no explanation for why entire families packed up overnight. The official story answers questions no one was asking and avoids the ones that mattered most. There is one document, though, that doesn't quite fit. It's a single-page report, unsigned, undated in the margin, filled under the wrong category. It doesn't accuse anyone. It doesn't demand action. It simply notes that accounts differ. That line is underlined. Once. Someone noticed. Someone hesitated. And then nothing. No follow-up, no amendment, no correction. The document stays where it is, quiet, ignored, but present. Like a splinter, history never removed. The official story did what it was meant to do. It calmed the public, protected reputations, preserved order. But it also created a problem, because when the truth is simplified, the details don't disappear. They wait, and they surface later, in whispers, in contradictions, in things the records can't explain. That's where this story starts to unravel, because the more closely you read what was written, the clearer it becomes what was deliberately left out. And once you see those gaps, you can't unsee them.
The problem with records is not what they say, it's what they assume you'll never notice. On the surface, everything appears complete. Dates line up, names are spelled correctly, forms are stamped and filed. But once you stop reading through the records and start reading into them, the cracks begin to show. The first inconsistency appears in the census. According to official numbers, the population barely changed. A few families moved, a few names were crossed out, nothing remarkable. But local tax logs tell a different story. Entire households vanish between entries, not transferred, not marked deceased, simply erased. No explanation follows, and no authority ever questioned it. Land deeds are worse. Properties that should have been contested were transferred without dispute. Valuations dropped overnight. Witness signatures repeat. Same names, same handwriting across unrelated transactions. It suggests urgency, or pressure, or both. People don't sell land for pennies unless they're desperate to leave or afraid to stay. There is also the matter of time. Some documents are dated before the events they describe. Others appear weeks late, as if written from memory instead of observation. One report references an incident that supposedly never occurred. Another quietly contradicts it. They coexist in the same archive. No correction, no explanation, just contradiction preserved. Then there are the missing people. Not the ones who died, the ones who survived. Individuals who appear in church rolls, school records, labor accounts, and then vanish entirely. No marriage records, no burial plots, no relocation documents. It's as if they stepped out of history, and history let them go. A local teacher once tried to track one of those names. She followed the trail to another county, then another. The name appeared once more in a ledger marked confidential. After that, nothing. When she asked about it, she was told the file was sealed. No reason given, no date for release. Just silence. Silence has weight, and in records like these, it leaves fingerprints. Medical logs are no better. A doctor's notes mention injuries that don't match reported causes. Bruising described where accidents wouldn't place them. Repeated visits for the same patients, close together, then never again. One entry ends mid-sentence. The rest of the page is blank, as if the pen stopped moving and never resumed. Church records contradict themselves. Baptisms listed without parents, funerals recorded without names, special services held with no explanation. One minister wrote of events that tested the soul of the congregation. He never wrote what those events were. The next entry is months later. Different handwriting, different tone. When records fail, people fill the gaps. And that's where the whispers begin to matter. Several older residents recalled being warned, quietly, not to speak to outsiders. Not by law enforcement, not by clergy, by neighbors. People who had lost something. People who looked afraid even years later. They didn't say what happened. They only said this: if you ask too much, you'll disappear from the records too. That might sound like exaggeration, until you notice a pattern. People who questioned the official story later encountered problems. Loans denied, jobs lost, reputations quietly destroyed. Nothing dramatic, nothing provable. Just enough pressure to teach a lesson. There is a letter written decades later, discovered in a family attic. It's short, carefully worded, and never sent. The writer says, "They changed the story, not all at once, little by little, until even I wasn't sure what I saw." The letter ends with a single line underlined twice. Memory is dangerous when no one else remembers with you. The records don't explain the fear. They don't explain the urgency. They don't explain why the silence lasted longer than the events themselves. They don't explain why so many people left without telling anyone where they were going. They don't explain why later generations were warned without being informed. And they don't explain why even now some documents remain sealed. But what they do explain, accidentally, is this: the official story was not designed to preserve truth. It was designed to preserve order. And order, once threatened, demanded compliance. What happened here was not just forgotten. It was managed, filtered,
rewritten, protected. And the more carefully the records try to look complete, the more obvious it becomes that something was deliberately removed. Because history doesn't leave gaps by accident. People create them. History records events. People live with the consequences. Long after the paperwork was filed and the official story settled into place, there were those who remained behind, quietly carrying what had happened without ever being allowed to name it. They didn't speak in dates. They didn't argue facts. They spoke in habits. Some families never let their children play past a certain fence line. Others locked their doors earlier than necessary. There were roads people avoided, not because they were dangerous, but because they felt wrong. These rules were never explained. They were inherited. One woman remembered being pulled back from a field as a child. She hadn't done anything wrong. She wasn't near the road. She was just curious. Her mother's grip left bruises. That night, she was told only this: "We don't go there, ever." No reason followed. None was needed. The people who lived with it learned to recognize each other. They spoke in glances, in half-sentences, in warnings disguised as jokes. A laugh could stop a conversation. A look could end it. Outsiders never noticed. That was the point. There were also those who tried to forget. They stayed busy. They focused on church, work, family. They avoided anything that reminded them of that time. But forgetting doesn't erase memory. It buries it. And buried things press upward. Some carried guilt, not because they caused what happened, but because they survived it. They asked themselves why their names remained in the records while others disappeared, why their families stayed intact while neighbors vanished. Survival can feel like complicity when no one is allowed to explain what they lived through. Then there were the children. Children notice what adults refuse to explain. They saw the fear before they understood the reason. They learned which names changed the mood in a room. They learned which stories stopped mid-sentence. And they learned early not to ask why. A boy once asked his grandfather about the place. The old man didn't answer right away. He stared at the floor for a long time, then said, "Some truths don't make you stronger, they just make the nights longer." That was the end of the conversation. The boy never asked again. Over time, the silence reshaped relationships. Marriages were affected by things never discussed. Friendships cooled over shared knowledge that couldn't be acknowledged. Entire families drifted apart because memory itself became dangerous. People weren't arguing about facts. They were protecting themselves from remembering. Church gatherings were the strangest. Everyone prayed together, everyone sang the same hymns, but certain pews were never filled. Certain names were never spoken aloud. Even forgiveness had boundaries. There were moments, though, brief and unguarded, when the truth slipped through. After funerals, late at night, after too much grief and not enough restraint, someone would say, "It didn't have to happen that way," and everyone would know exactly what they meant. Living with it meant learning to function alongside something unresolved. It meant teaching the next generation what to avoid without explaining why. It meant carrying fear without ever naming its source. It meant watching outsiders move freely through places locals avoided. And it meant understanding that silence wasn't weakness. It was survival. The official story lived in documents.
The real story lived in people, in how they walked, in how they hesitated, in what they refused to pass down. And those who lived with it understood something the records never captured. What happened here didn't end when it was over. It continued in memory, in fear, in the choices people made long after the truth was buried. And it was that quiet endurance, the way ordinary people carried something unbearable, that allowed the rumors to survive. Because silence doesn't erase truth. It teaches it how to hide.
When the records stop speaking, rumors begin. Not all at once, not loudly. They move quietly, through kitchens, across back porches, in the spaces where people feel safe enough to be honest. These weren't stories meant to be believed. They were stories meant to be remembered. Rumors filled the gaps the records refused to explain. They contradicted the official story, but never directly. They didn't accuse anyone by name. They spoke in suggestions, in possibilities. Something went wrong. Someone crossed a line. Someone else paid the price. And everyone understood who those someones were, even when no one said it out loud. One rumor claimed the event was an accident, that things escalated too quickly, that no one planned for the outcome, that panic, not cruelty, decided what followed. But even this version admitted something important. People chose silence instead of responsibility. Another rumor said it was deliberate, that warnings were ignored, that boundaries were crossed, that power protected itself the moment consequences appeared. This version never named the victims. It didn't have to. The rumors were inconsistent. That's how you know they mattered. If they were false, they would have settled into one story. Instead, they shifted, depending on who was speaking and what they were afraid of. Some versions minimized, others exaggerated, but all of them agreed on one thing. What happened was never meant to leave that place. Children absorbed these stories without understanding them. They heard phrases like "after that summer" or "before things changed." They noticed adults lowering their voices. They sensed when curiosity crossed an invisible line. No one corrected them. No one clarified, because correction would require explanation. There were also rules, unwritten, unspoken. Don't go there alone. Don't bring outsiders. Don't ask questions in public. And most important of all, don't write anything down. One woman admitted she kept a journal as a girl. She wrote about dreams she didn't understand, about screams she thought she imagined, about the way adults acted afterward. Years later, she burned it. Not because she stopped believing it was true, but because she realized it was dangerous. Rumors don't survive unless they serve a purpose. These didn't entertain, they warned. They taught people where not to walk, who not to trust, what history demanded to stay buried. And they persisted long after the people involved were gone. Some versions suggested there were more victims than the records admitted. Others claimed certain bodies were never found, that graves were moved, that names were changed. No proof, but no denial either. What's striking isn't how wild the rumors were, it's how careful they were. No monsters, no legends, just human behavior taken too far. Cruelty enabled by silence, violence softened by authority, consequences absorbed by the powerless. There was one rumor almost everyone agreed on, that after the incident, whenever it truly was, someone tried to speak, and something happened to make sure they never did again. What that something was depended on who told the story.
loss of livelihood, forced relocation, a sudden illness, each version different, each ending the same way. The rumors were never written because writing makes things permanent, and permanence threatens carefully managed truth. So the stories stayed fluid, passed from mouth to ear, from parent to child, from memory to memory. Easy to deny, impossible to erase. And while the official story pretended everything was resolved, the rumors kept one truth alive. Something happened here that the records couldn't contain. Something the people who lived with it were never allowed to process. Something that would surface again when patterns began to emerge. Because rumors are only the beginning. What comes next is evidence. If stories like this matter to you, stories history tried to bury, subscribe, like, and share this. And tell me in the comments, do you believe rumors exist because of fear or because of truth?
Rumors are easy to dismiss. Patterns are not. For years, what happened here was treated as an isolated incident, an unfortunate moment, safely contained in the past. But when you widen the lens, something else appears. Not repetition, consistency. The first pattern shows up in the dates. Events linked to this place, fires, disappearances, sudden departures, cluster unnaturally close together. Not once, multiple times, separated by months, sometimes years, always just close enough to suggest cause, not coincidence. The second pattern is location. Every related incident occurred along the same routes, the same boundaries, the same edges of town. Places people already avoided, places where oversight was thin, where authority rarely lingered, places that could absorb trouble without drawing attention. Then there are the people, not victims, not perpetrators, witnesses. Those who saw too much or asked too many questions tended to experience similar outcomes. They moved suddenly. They lost standing. They faded from public life. Not punished, removed. One man appears in 3 different accounts, once as a neighbor, once as a laborer, once as a witness. In each case, his involvement ends the same way. He leaves town within weeks. No forwarding address, no farewell, just absence. Authorities responded the same way each time. Minimal documentation, rapid conclusions, no escalation. The phrase, "no further action required," appears again and again, not because nothing happened, but because acknowledging a pattern would require intervention, and intervention would require accountability. The most disturbing pattern, though, is what didn't happen. There were no investigations that crossed county lines, no inquiries that connected events together. No one asked whether these incidents were related. Every case was treated as standalone, which is exactly how patterns survive. Local newspapers unknowingly reinforce this. Headlines use similar language across different years. Unfortunate event, tragic occurrence, community shocked. The words change, the structure does not. There is a ledger kept by a merchant who supplied several surrounding towns. His records show sudden drops in orders following each incident. Food, clothing, tools. Entire households stopped buying overnight. That's not how normal decline works. That's how evacuation works. At some point, someone must have noticed. A clerk, a preacher, a deputy. Someone must have seen the repetition and understood what it meant. But recognizing a pattern creates responsibility, and responsibility was the one thing no one wanted. So instead, they explained it away. Bad luck, economic downturn,
personal disputes, anything that preserved the illusion of normalcy. Patterns don't demand belief, they demand acknowledgement. And once you see them, they change everything. They tell you this was not chaos, it was structure, not accidental, not random. Something was allowed to happen here, again and again, because the system around it was designed to look away. And the longer it went unchallenged, the easier it became to repeat. That is when silence stopped being passive. It became policy.
Silence does not become powerful on its own. It becomes powerful when institutions protect it. By the time the pattern was clear, at least to those willing to see, it was already too late to stop without consequences. Acknowledging what was happening would mean admitting it had been allowed to happen. And so the silence changed. It stopped being an absence. It became a strategy. The first sign was coordination. Different offices, law enforcement, courts, churches began telling the same story, using the same language, not because they were told what to say, because they understood what not to say. Reports shortened, investigations narrowed, questions quietly discouraged. People who pushed were reminded of their place, not with threats, but with reminders of reputation, of family, of what could be lost. The law didn't need to intervene openly. It simply had to stop intervening at all. Calls went unanswered, complaints stalled, witnesses were unavailable. And every delay taught the same lesson: this is not something you pursue. Churches played their part. Sermons shifted, less about justice, more about order, less about accountability, more about forgiveness. Sin was discussed without naming harm, healing without acknowledging wounds, and anyone who insisted on specifics was gently reminded that division was worse than silence. The courts were more precise. Cases were dismissed on technicalities, testimonies ruled inadmissible, evidence declared insufficient, each decision defensible on its own, together undeniable. Silence became efficient. It required no paperwork, no meetings, no records that could later be discovered. All it required was mutual understanding and fear. Those who benefited from the silence prospered. Land accumulated. Influence grew. Names became respected. Those who didn't benefit learned to adapt or leave. At some point, the silence outlived its creators. New officials inherited it without ever being told why it existed. They followed precedent, signed where others had signed, dismissed what others had dismissed. Silence doesn't need belief. It only needs momentum. There is a memo from years later, brief, impersonal. It advises that reopening old matters would be counterproductive. No justification, just a conclusion, as if the outcome mattered more than the truth. And that is how the silence hardened, not as conspiracy, as convenience. No single villain, no secret meeting, just a shared decision not to look too closely. By the time the incident, whatever its true nature, could no longer be denied, the system was already trained to absorb it, to bury it, to move on. And anyone who tried to disrupt that process became the problem. This is the moment when silence stops being passive, when it becomes enforceable, when it becomes policy. And once silence is policy, the next event is inevitable. Something happens that cannot be ignored, something so visible, so disruptive that the system fractures, if only briefly.
For a long time, silence worked. It absorbed rumors. It smoothed over patterns. It taught people where the boundaries were.
And then something happened that refused to stay inside them. No one agrees on the exact moment it began. Some say it started with an argument, others with a mistake. A few insist it was inevitable, that it had been building for years, waiting for the smallest push. What everyone agrees on is this: after that day, nothing felt contained anymore. The incident didn't happen in secret. That was the problem. It unfolded in daylight, within sight, within earshot. Too many people saw pieces of it. Too many stories emerged at once. For the first time, silence had competition. Accounts vary. Some say there was shouting. Others remember running. A few recall a sound, sharp, sudden, that didn't belong there. And then there was stillness. The kind that falls when people realize they've crossed a line they can't step back over. Authorities arrived quickly, faster than usual, too fast for coincidence. The area was secured. Witnesses were separated. Questions were limited. This wasn't investigation. It was containment. Official reports describe the incident as brief, contained, resolved. They use words like altercation and unfortunate outcome. They avoid describing what people actually saw, because what people saw didn't fit the pattern of silence. It demanded explanation, and explanation threatened everything that had been carefully maintained. There were injuries that didn't align with the report, damage that suggested panic, not order, testimonies that contradicted one another but agreed on one thing. This was not supposed to happen this way. Someone was taken away, not arrested, removed. No public record explains where. Another person was treated on site, quietly, without documentation. A third was never mentioned again. That absence became the loudest detail of all. Within days, the narrative solidified. A version of events circulated that everyone was expected to accept. Witnesses were reminded of what they hadn't seen. Details were softened, timelines adjusted. People who insisted otherwise found themselves isolated. Not threatened, isolated. This was the moment when the system almost failed. Too many people knew too much. Too many questions lingered. For a brief window, truth felt possible. And then the window closed. The incident was reframed as an exception, a rare breakdown, an anomaly. Proof, ironically, that the system usually worked. That framing mattered, because if this was the only time something went wrong, then nothing else needed to be revisited. But those who were there never forgot. They carried the memory like a fracture that never healed properly, something that aches when pressure is applied. In the weeks that followed, changes were made. Routes were altered, procedures revised, access restricted. Not officially, quietly, as if preparing for something similar to happen again. That's how you know this incident mattered, not because of what was said afterwards, but because of what was changed. For the first time, silence had been challenged, and although it survived, it did so by evolving, by tightening, by making sure that next time there would be fewer witnesses. This was the point of no return. After this, there would be consequences. Not immediate, not obvious, but inevitable. Because once silence is threatened, it demands a response.
and the response would not be subtle.
After the incident, there was an unspoken understanding. Someone had to be blamed. Not officially, not on paper, but blamed enough to restore balance. Because systems like this don't survive on truth, they survive on consequences. And those consequences are rarely assigned to the right people. The first changes were subtle. Names stopped appearing on schedules. Families received vague explanations. Access was temporarily suspended. Temporary, in this place, often meant permanent. The people who paid first were not the ones who caused the incident. They were the ones closest to it, the ones who saw too much, the ones who asked the wrong questions, the ones who didn't understand that curiosity had a cost. One worker was reassigned overnight. No explanation, no farewell. Their replacement arrived already briefed, already careful. Another was dismissed for a procedural violation no one could remember enforcing before. A third simply vanished from records entirely, as if they had never been there. And then there were the families. They noticed changes long before anyone else did. Visits shortened, communication delayed, answers replaced with rehearsed phrases, the language of distancing. It's important to understand something here. This wasn't punishment. Punishment is loud. Punishment wants to be seen. This was correction, quiet, efficient, designed to teach without explanation. Rumors began to circulate, not openly, in fragments. Someone knew someone who had spoken out. Someone else had tried to document inconsistencies. Another had been overheard saying the system wasn't what it claimed to be. All of them experienced the same outcome: removal. Meanwhile, the official narrative remained untouched. The incident was still an anomaly, a closed chapter. Anyone who challenged that framing was subtly reminded of their place. Some tried to fight back. They requested meetings, filed reports, asked for reviews. Nothing came of it, because there was nothing to respond to. No denial, no confirmation, just silence. And silence, when sustained long enough, becomes its own answer. The most disturbing part wasn't what happened to those people. It was how quickly everyone else adapted. Colleagues stopped making eye contact. Conversations became shorter. Questions died before reaching the mouth. Fear didn't spread. It settled. That's how systems protect themselves, not through violence, not through threats, but by teaching people that survival depends on compliance. Within months, the environment felt different, not safer, just quieter, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. The people who paid the price were never acknowledged. No memorials, no corrections, no reconsideration. They became warnings instead, and warnings are far more effective when they're unofficial. But something unexpected happened. Instead of erasing doubt, the punishment sharpened it. Those who remained began noticing patterns they hadn't seen before. Timing, consistency, the precision with which consequences were applied. And a dangerous realization formed. If innocent people could be removed so easily, then the system wasn't fragile. It was confident that it would never be challenged. That realization changed how people looked at everything that came after.
every rule, every adjustment, every unexplained decision. Because once you see who pays the price, you start asking who never does. And that question leads somewhere the system cannot allow.
Patterns don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves quietly to people who are already paying attention. And by the time most people notice them, they've already existed for years. At first, the connections felt accidental. One case dismissed, another delayed, a third quietly rewritten. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could stand alone. But when someone began lining them up, dates beside names, names beside outcomes, something emerged that couldn't be unseen. The same responses, the same language, the same outcomes. Different situations, same conclusion. Whenever the truth pointed upward, the system stalled. Whenever it pointed sideways, the system acted. Speed depended on direction. Someone noticed that investigations only progressed when they threatened no one with influence. Another noticed that accountability always stopped one step short of power. A third noticed that every mistake benefited the same small circle of people. That's when coincidence died. The records told a story the official narrative never did. A rhythm, an order, an invisible boundary no one was allowed to cross. Those inside the system began sharing observations, but carefully. Not in meetings, not in writing, in fragments. A look, a sentence cut short, a question never finished. Because by now, everyone understood the rules. You don't accuse, you imply. You don't document, you remember. One individual, careful, methodical, began mapping outcomes instead of causes. Not why something happened, but what always followed. The results were chillingly consistent. Every time someone pushed too far, they lost access, they lost standing, they lost credibility, sometimes all three. But here's what made Chapter 10 unavoidable. The pattern didn't just explain the past, it predicted the future. Before decisions were announced, outcomes were already known. Before reports were released, their conclusions could be guessed. Before consequences were assigned, everyone knew who would be untouched. The system had become a machine, not malicious, efficient. It didn't need intent anymore. It functioned automatically. And machines don't feel guilt. They only follow design. That realization spread quietly, and with it something far more dangerous than anger: clarity. People stopped asking if something was wrong. They started asking how long it had been wrong. And once that question exists, the next question always follows. Who built it this way? That question never gets answered peacefully. Before we continue, pause with me for a moment. If you're still listening, I want to hear from you. Have you ever noticed a pattern that everyone else insisted wasn't there? Drop a comment with where you're listening from and whether you believe systems protect truth or themselves. If stories like this matter to you, make sure you're subscribed and share this with someone who pays attention.
Once a system becomes predictable, it can be tested. Not loudly, not recklessly, quietly. The person who decided to test it wasn't reckless or angry. They were patient. They understood the pattern better than anyone else because they had helped uncover it. They didn't challenge power directly. That would have been dismissed. Instead,
They created a situation that forced the system to choose. A case that followed every rule, every protocol, every procedure. No shortcuts, no accusations, just evidence. The kind of evidence that didn't accuse anyone outright, but pointed uncomfortably close. If the system worked as claimed, it would proceed normally. If it worked as designed, it would shut down. The test was simple. Introduce verified facts that required action, but only if neutrality truly existed. At first, nothing happened. No resistance, no warnings, which almost felt reassuring. Then came the delay. Small at first. A meeting postponed, a signature missing, a request lost. Exactly as predicted. When the delay didn't work, the language changed. Concerns were raised, not about facts, but about tone. Questions about intent replaced questions about accuracy. Suddenly, the problem wasn't what was presented, it was why it was presented. That's when the tester knew. The system had chosen. Within weeks, subtle consequences followed. Access reduced, communication slowed, invitations stopped arriving. Nothing official, nothing punishable, nothing you could point to, just isolation. The test had confirmed the pattern perfectly, but confirmation came with a cost, because systems don't like being exposed, even quietly. Someone warned them. Not directly, just a sentence dropped in passing. Be careful what you make visible. That sentence carried weight. It meant you've been noticed. The tester didn't back down. They adjusted, stopped pushing evidence forward, started observing reactions instead. And what they saw was worse than resistance. It was coordination. Different offices, different people, same timing, same language, same decisions. No orders were given, no conspiracy required. The system corrected itself. That's when the final realization hit. There was no villain, there was no mastermind, just a structure that rewarded silence and punished disturbance. The test proved one thing beyond doubt. Truth wasn't dangerous, disruption was. And now that someone had disrupted the flow, the system would respond. Not immediately, not violently, but permanently. Because systems don't retaliate, they remove variables. If you've ever seen someone quietly disappear after asking the wrong question, you already understand this. Let me know in the comments if you think systems can be fixed or only replaced. And if you're still with this story, stay close. The consequences are about to surface.
Knowledge doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in layers. And sometimes the final layer is the one you wish you'd never uncovered. At first, the cost wasn't obvious. There was no punishment, no confrontation, no moment where someone said, "You've gone too far." Instead, life simply narrowed. Opportunities faded quietly. Doors that once opened no longer did. And that's how the system protects itself. The tester began noticing small changes, not dramatic ones, but patterns. Phone calls stopped being returned. Requests that once took days now took months. Meetings were canceled without explanation. None of this could be proven. That was the point. When they tried to explain what was happening, the response was always the same. You're reading too much into it. Which is another way of saying, we don't want to hear this. The real cost revealed itself slowly, not in career damage, but in isolation. People grew careful. Conversations became shallow. Old allies avoided eye contact.
Curiosity is contagious, and fear spreads faster. The tester realized something painful. They weren't being silenced because they were wrong. They were being distanced because they were too clear. Clarity makes people uncomfortable, especially when it removes excuses. At night, doubt crept in, not about the facts, but about the decision to pursue them. Was it worth it? Knowing what you now know, would you choose ignorance instead? That's the question that haunts people who get too close. Because once you see the structure clearly, you can't unsee it. And ignorance, once lost, never comes back. The tester began documenting everything, not to expose, not to accuse, but to remember. Because memory is the last thing systems can't fully erase. Files were copied, notes were hidden, timelines reconstructed just in case. They understood now. The system didn't need to destroy them. It only needed to make them irrelevant. And irrelevance is a quiet kind of erasure. Still, something unexpected happened. Others began noticing the same patterns, not because they were told, but because once you know what to look for, you can't stop seeing it. The cost of knowing too much is high, but the cost of everyone knowing nothing is higher. And that's when the story stops being about one person and starts becoming something else entirely. What happens next isn't exposure. It isn't justice. It's something far more dangerous.
The night the triplets disappeared was not ordinary. It wasn't just cold. It was still. The kind of still that feels like the world has paused to watch. For weeks before, people had noticed the boys growing quieter. Not shy, not withdrawn, just absent. Like their presence was being measured and found too heavy. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. The air changed around them. Even the most skeptical began to sense something different. That night, the meeting house felt like a place waiting for a decision. Not a building, a judgment. Samuel Whitmore had been uneasy for days. Not because of the boys, because of the way the world was changing. The tension in the region had escalated. Federal patrols increased. Rumors of raids grew louder. And the boys, they had been sensing it all. Samuel tried to speak to them about it, but they didn't respond the way children should. They spoke like adults, not angry, not scared, just certain. "We can't stay," Isaac told him. Caleb nodded. Ezra didn't speak, but his eyes said the same thing. Samuel asked why. He asked for a plan, for a reason, for something he could hold on to. The boys didn't explain. They didn't need to. They only said, "They're coming." The words were simple, but the meaning was heavy, because Samuel knew who they were. The federal marshals, the men who wanted to study them, to control them, to use them. That night, Samuel made arrangements, quietly, without fanfare. He told no one, because the boys had made it clear, if anyone knew, it would become impossible. He watched them pack, not with excitement, with the seriousness of people leaving their own graves. They didn't pack toys. They packed nothing that mattered, just small bundles, a few clothes, and the most precious thing they had left, silence. Samuel asked them where they would go. They answered with a phrase that chilled him to his bones.
where no one can hear us. The last memory Samuel recorded was of the boys walking out into the dark, not running, not hiding, walking, like they belonged to the night. The marshals arrived hours later, too late. The meeting house was empty. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, no footprints, just 3 small bundles missing from the room where the boys had slept. The search began immediately. Horses, dogs, men. They combed the woods. They checked every cave and hollow. They asked every nearby farm. They questioned everyone who had ever been near the meeting house. But the triplets were gone, as if they had been erased from the land itself. People expected to find them, because that's what humans do. We assume everything has a place, even disappearances. But the boys had taught them otherwise. The most unsettling part wasn't that they vanished, it was what happened afterwards. The world continued. The meeting house continued. The underground network continued. But something inside the community changed. A deep, ancient fear settled in, because they knew if the boys could vanish, then anyone could. And that fear was not about being hunted, it was about being seen. Because if you can vanish, you can also be found. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Do you believe the triplets truly vanished, or were they taken? Comment below with your theory. And if you're still listening, hit subscribe, because the next chapter reveals what the records didn't want you to know.
In the weeks after the triplets vanished, the community struggled to breathe. Every morning brought the same empty question: where are they? Days passed, then weeks, then months, and the only thing that remained was silence. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. No stamp, no return address, just a thin piece of paper folded carefully. It was addressed to Samuel Whitmore. He didn't open it right away, not because he was afraid, because he didn't want to hope, because hope in their world was dangerous. When he finally unfolded it, the handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were unmistakable. You should have listened. Samuel felt the paper tremble in his hands, not from fear, from a sudden, deep realization. Someone had been watching. Someone had known. The letter continued, not long, but enough to change everything. The boys are not gone. They are being used. They are being studied. They are being trained. Samuel reread it 3 times. His mind raced. The words were too specific, too detailed, too accurate. And then he saw the final line, the line that made his blood run cold. If you want them back, stop searching, start listening. That sentence was a trap, or a clue, or both, because it implied something Samuel had never considered, that the boys had left a message behind, a message that wasn't meant to be read by everyone, only by the ones who could understand. Samuel began searching the letter for hidden meaning, every word, every spacing, every pause. He knew the boys were clever, but he had never realized just how clever. He found it in the final line, a pattern, a code, not obvious, not simple, but deliberate. The letter contained a set of coordinates, not a place, a path, a route, a map that only someone who knew the land could follow. Samuel knew the land better than anyone, and the path described wasn't random. It led to a place no one spoke about, a place that didn't appear on maps, a place that existed in whispers.
The old meeting house had a hidden room, a room that had been used for years, not for meetings, for storage, for supplies, for people who needed to disappear. The path in the letter led there. Samuel returned to the meeting house that night. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't bring anyone. He went alone. The hidden room was still there. The same boards, the same nails, the same smell of old wood and dust. But something had changed. A symbol had been carved in the wall, not by a tool, by a hand. The symbol was one the boys had used before, a mark of departure, a mark of transformation. Samuel realized something terrifying. The boys hadn't been taken. They had left, and they had left behind a message for those who were brave enough to follow. The letter was not just proof. It was a challenge, a warning, a test, and it meant one thing clearly. They were not only alive, they were trying to be found. Pause here. What do you think the boys were trying to communicate with that letter? Drop your theory in the comments. If you want to continue this story and uncover the truth, make sure you like and subscribe. In the next chapter, we follow the path the letter described, and what Samuel finds there is not a rescue, it's a revelation.
Samuel returned to the meeting house at night. The moon was hidden behind clouds. The air was heavy with the smell of rain, and the building itself seemed different. Not because anything had changed physically, but because now Samuel knew there was something inside it he couldn't see. He found the hidden entrance exactly where the letter described, a loose board in the floor, a small space behind it, the kind of place you only notice if you're looking for it. Samuel removed the board and lowered himself down. The space was narrow, too narrow for comfort, but it opened into a larger room below. The room was dark, not pitch black, just dim, as if the light itself was afraid to enter. Samuel lit a lantern. The flame flickered, and for a moment he felt the sensation of being watched, not by a person, by something older, something that existed before the building, before the town, before the people. The room was filled with objects, not furniture, not supplies, things that didn't belong. A stack of old journals, a set of strange instruments, a small pile of cloth wrapped tightly around something, and on the far wall, a series of photographs. Samuel walked closer. His hands trembled. The photographs were old, not new, not recent, but the faces in them were familiar. They were the triplets, not as children, as they looked now, older, different, changed. Samuel felt his stomach drop. He had expected them to be lost, not transformed, not altered. On the table below the photographs was a journal. Samuel opened it. The first page was filled with the boys' handwriting. Not one of the boys, all three, as if they had written it together. The journal began with a statement, a declaration, not about where they were, but about what they had become. We are not the same. We are no longer only children. We have learned what they wanted us to learn, and now we must decide what to do with it. Samuel read further. The journal described a process, not physical, not medical, but mental, a training, a conditioning, a transformation of thought. They had been taught to listen, to understand patterns, to predict outcomes, to anticipate behavior, not as a gift, as a weapon. Samuel realized the truth. The boys hadn't been taken to be harmed. They had been taken to be used as tools, as instruments of influence, as something that could change the system from the inside.
The journal continued. The boys had been taught to communicate through code, to leave messages that only the right minds could interpret, to hide in plain sight. And that's when Samuel saw it. A second message, a hidden note inside the journal, not written in ink, but carved into the paper, a pattern of indentations, a code. Samuel traced the marks with his fingers, and he understood. The boys weren't just trying to escape. They were trying to start a movement, a hidden resistance, a way to fight the system using the system's own rules. But the final line of the journal was the most terrifying, because it wasn't written like a message. It was written like a warning. If you follow us, you will not return the same. Samuel sat in the dark, the lantern flickering, the hidden room around him like a throat ready to swallow. He understood now. The boys had not vanished. They had become something else, and whatever they had become was not waiting to be rescued. It was waiting to be joined. Would you follow the triplets if you knew you could never return the same? Comment your answer below. And if you want to keep watching this story unfold, make sure you like, subscribe, and share. The next chapter is the final chapter. It will reveal what the boys truly became and why the system feared them more than anything else.
Samuel stayed in the hidden room until dawn. The journal lay open on the table. The photographs stared back like a promise. And the truth sat heavy in the air. The boys were not missing. They were not dead. They were not even trapped. They were chosen. Chosen by the system. Not as victims, but as instruments. The system didn't need to destroy people. It needed to shape them, to build them into something useful, to turn them into a force that could move without being seen. The boys had been trained to listen to patterns, to predict behavior, to understand the motivations of powerful men, to anticipate the actions of those who believed they were in control. They had become a new kind of weapon, not one that kills, one that influences, one that manipulates, one that changes minds without anyone noticing. Samuel realized that the triplets weren't being held against their will. They were being prepared to be placed inside the system, to be used as a new generation of operatives, to be the hidden hands that would steer decisions. The system didn't fear them because they were powerful. It feared them because they were uncontrollable. No one could predict what three minds combined could do. No one could guarantee their loyalty, and that made them dangerous. The journal revealed that the boys had agreed to something, not out of fear, out of choice. A choice made after understanding the cost, after understanding what the system was, after understanding what they could become. They had decided to become the very thing the system feared, not to destroy it, but to change it from within. Samuel understood the final line now, the warning, the choice, the truth. If you follow us, you will not return the same. Because the boys weren't leaving to be rescued. They were leaving to become part of something greater, something hidden, something that could never be exposed. Samuel realized the most terrifying part of all. The system didn't need to silence him anymore, because he already understood. He had seen the truth. He had become part of the story, and the story would continue without him. When Samuel emerged from the hidden room, the world looked the same, but he knew it wasn't.
He knew the system was no longer a distant machine. It was a living organism, and he had been inside its body. The truth was simple and devastating. The system was not built to protect people. It was built to protect itself, and it would continue to do so, with or without witnesses. The triplets were not victims, they were architects, not of destruction, but of a new kind of control. A control so quiet, so subtle, that no one would ever know they were being led. The final message in the journal was not a warning, it was a promise.